talk about, and it might seem a given, what is sexual assault?
Such a great question, and not a given. I think that a lot of people have different definitions, and for the people who are watching this show, I think the most important thing to know is that people find a definition that sits true for them. I can share from our perspective, but I think a lot of people struggle with trying to define their own experience, and like I said, choice is so important. And so when I get asked the question of, do you think what happened to me was sexual assault, or do you think what happened to me was rape, I usually want to reflect back to that person that, number one, it takes a lot of courage to share an experience like that. It sounds like they were hurt, and that's what I care about. Whatever they want to call it is fine. So for us to know that as significant others, friends and family is important too, because sometimes I think we want to find a word, a definition. But for people who are curious, and for your question, sexual assault's a really broad term. It's really talking about any kind of unwanted sexual touching or comments or interactions, behavior. And I use the term unwanted and not force, because I think sometimes, especially what we see in the media, is that when we hear about rape or we hear about sexual assault, it's oftentimes only examples of very violent sexual assaults. And so that leaves out a lot of people who wonder, well, was what happened to me really sexual assault because there wasn't a gun, or I wasn't beaten, or something like that. So it's really something that was unwanted, that was not consensual.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's take an example why that would be something that's questionable.
Something
So
that
is there an example that you could give that would make somebody say, well, what happened to me a sexual assault?
Yeah. So just to step back for a second, sexual assault is what we call an umbrella term. It incorporates many things underneath it. So things like rape, things like molest, things like sexual harassment, all of those are forms of sexual assault.
Is there a difference between a molestation and rape?
The difference there is penetration. That's what the legal definition is really looking at. And there's nuances in the legal terms and all that kind of stuff, but just for layman's terms, just kind of understanding. We really look at molest as something that's unwanted touching of the body, and rape as something that includes penetration. And again, things that are unwanted. So in terms of those questionable areas, I think it comes back to that point again, that so many of these are situations in which the person knew and trusted the other person on some level. And so in those situations, I think oftentimes there may be physical violence, but oftentimes there's things like manipulation, coercion, taking advantage of somebody in some state, whether it's an age difference or being under the influence of substances, things like that, which for many people they feel like, well, is that real rape? Because again, our only real showing of it in the media is something that's very violent and very graphic. And so it leaves a lot of people questioning, if I loved this person before they did this, what was that? One of the very vulnerable groups to sexual assault is children. And so unfortunately, some adults, and we depend on adults when we're kids to help us understand the world. If we're 3 and we throw a block at somebody, we depend on an adult to say, that's not okay to throw a block at somebody. So if the adult that we trust and look up to help us understand the world is doing things to us that technically aren't okay, that we don't really like on a body, emotional level, but they tell us, no, it's okay for adults and kids to act this way, or for family members to interact in this way, it can be really confusing about, well, is this okay or is this not, especially if it's being told as this is our little secret.